Hi, my name is Rutherford Craze, and I'm a type designer and a developer. I graduated from the Type and Media MA course here in The Hague in 2019, and last year I started my own type foundry, Massdriver. A big focus I have throughout all of my work is on tools, not just the physical instruments that I use for writing and sketching, but also digital tools for making, testing, and even selling and distributing type. The tools we use influence the work that we do. Different pens produce different strokes, different methods of digitizing produce different outlines. Font editors that enable easy interpolation between masters means we see more typefaces with different styles that share a common point structure. One of the ways I try to keep my work unique is by making tools myself, though that idea isn't uncommon among this industry. A lot of type designers and foundries have their own collections of scripts and tools for streamlining their workflows, and in some cases for helping them to produce designs that they otherwise couldn't. In September last year, I released the Massdriver Workshop, a collection of small web-based tools for working with fonts. It's a website that anyone can visit, and so anyone with a browser can use these tools without needing to know code or install anything. Right now, there are just two, and I'll explain in a bit what they are and a little about how they work. But for now, let me tell you how all this got started. Back in the autumn of 2019, I just graduated from Type and Media, where I'd become quite familiar with Python scripting and working with code in general. I was interning at Fontsmith in London, and during a break, I was talking to my colleague Alessia about specimens, specifically about this style of specimen with a list of words that are all matching the same length. I think we were both wondering how they were made, if people had a script to generate them, or if everyone was just spending a really long time typing out words by hand. I kind of saw this as a coding challenge. I couldn't immediately see how you would program something like that, and I wanted to figure it out. So this was my first attempt in Drawbot, which, if you're not familiar with, is a really nice tool for visual scripting in Python. I knew I needed a fairly big list of words. In this case, I found about 58,000 online from subtitle data. And I also knew measuring all of those words would take a really long time. So my first attempt would go through every word in the list, measure its length in the font you specify, and create another file containing the word and its run length together. Once it's done that, it simply takes the length you request and goes through the cache file, comparing the pre-calculated lengths with your input. Every match it finds goes into a list, and when it's done, it gives you a random set of those results. If it doesn't find a match, it goes back through the list but accepts a slightly wider range of values. It'll repeat that until it either finds the number of results you wanted, or the range gets too big and it gives up. There are a few issues with the way I was doing things here. Firstly, the method I was using for caching the pre-measured results wasn't great. I wasn't ordering the cache file in any way, so to find a specific length, you had to check every single word. The much faster solution would have been to group words of the same length into sets, and then list those sets in ascending or descending order. The second issue with my Drawbot script is that the way of measuring the words that I came up with was stupid. You can go to the GitHub repo and see the precise nature of the stupid yourself if you'd like. In short, rather than just writing out the word and measuring it, for each character, I would reference the font's character map table to find the corresponding glyph, then read its width and add that value to the word's length. I would then check the font's kerning table. For every combination of characters in the word, I'd sum up all the positive and negative kerning values and adjust the length accordingly. That was the number that I'd eventually put in the cache file. Python is a great programming language in my opinion. It's easy to learn and really versatile, but it is absolutely not fast. Using Python to decompile a font, read and cross-reference its tables 58,000 times, then add up the results and write them to a file, it takes ages. I think I was also aware of this at the time, but I couldn't immediately think of a better way of doing it. So I posted this online. I put the script on GitHub, tweeted the link, and I was a little surprised at how many people seemed to be interested. I was also using the script occasionally for my own work, although it was quite clunky to use in a lot of cases. On my Foundry's website, I used it to generate these full-width hero words for each typeface, and I've also used it in making specimens elsewhere. A couple of months after posting the Drawbot script, I was working on the website for my Foundry, and I found some reference to this HTML canvas method called measure text. It's fairly self-explanatory, I think. It measures the width of some text in a specific font. But most importantly, it measures it really fast. I put together a quick demo with this, which was pretty much the same code from my Drawbot script, but converted to JavaScript so I could use this measure text feature. I made a few other performance improvements at the same time, like sorting the cache file a bit more efficiently. I hit run and I was blown away. It was so much faster than the Drawbot script. It was pretty much instantaneous. It went through the whole list of words, measured the lengths, and gave a meaningful output in like less than half a second. I don't have the actual demo I used back then, but this is a live version which shares pretty much the same code. As well as being faster, it's also quite a bit more approachable. The interface is drag and drop rather than editing code parameters, and you don't need to install anything to use it. At this point, I'd already published the Drawbot version on GitHub, and somewhere along the line, I made the decision that I wanted to publish the browser version for free if it worked, and I now knew that it worked. I was making all of this in my free time, and I felt weird about the idea of monetizing it. I didn't want to lock anyone out because of the cost, and I also didn't want to just dump it on GitHub because then downloading it and running it locally becomes a pain. Although it runs in a browser and it uses web technologies, it's not a website. But maybe it should be. Maybe something you can access instantly and use as part of your design process without having to install and update. And if I did make it a website, I could also publish other tools alongside it. I could turn it into a little collection for people to make use of. And I want to be clear, this was not an original idea. I was already using, and I still do use, Dynamo Darkroom, Samsa by Lawrence Penny, and Roel Niesken's excellent Whack-A-My Fondue. I think it's fantastic to have such an ecosystem of these web tools, and actually part of my enthusiasm for publishing my own things was that I might get to join that list. I ended up being quite confident that I'd want to publish more tools than just the one I'd made so far, which I'd started calling Waterfall at this point. Probably starting out with 2 tools would be a better way to communicate that I wanted to publish more and invite suggestions for others. So I was thinking about what the second one should be, and really there was one clear winner. You might have noticed, but when I talk about the workshop, I'm trying not to say anything about who the target audience is. Just by saying tools for type designers, I think I would be maybe discouraging other people who work with fonts, graphic designers, typographers, developers, and so on. The second tool I added is something I made for myself in those roles as much as a type designer. I've called it Overview because effectively that's just what it is. A font contains a whole bunch of data, as well as just the drawings for a particular typeface or style. It has a name, which is not the same as the file name. It has a version number, manufacturer information, copyright info, and a lot of numbers describing its metrics and proportions. As a type designer, it's not difficult to find this information. If the license allows, you can open the font in your font editor, you can TTX it, you might even have desktop software for reading the tables. But as a graphic designer, you probably don't have that option. And even as a type designer, it's not quick to do it this way. Maybe you just want to check the copyright string or how big the excite is really quickly. It's not super often that you need to do this, but it happens from time to time, and when you can't easily find that information, it can be quite frustrating. The Overview tool is my solution to that problem. You drop a font on the page, and it surfaces a selection of the most useful metrics and metadata in that font. It's not showing everything because there's a lot, but it'll still tell you at least all of the things I find myself most often needing to check. And like the Waterfall tool, it's pretty much instantaneous. So that was how I got to this point. I released these 2 tools as the Massdriver Workshop in September last year, and after a month or so of feedback from various people, I updated the UI and added a few additional features to make them a little more easy to use. I also made a couple of these little illustrations for the tools, describing what they do using their analog equivalents that kind of amused me. I mentioned before, but you can use all of these for free online. The link is here if you want to. So I'd also like to talk about what's next for the workshop project. But first, let me briefly take you through how it works on a technical level. It's not exactly open source, but the code isn't hidden if you want to go through it yourself on the live website. The site itself is set up almost identically to my Foundry site, so it's easier to maintain and I can share code between them. It's a Flask app running on Vercel's serverless platform, if that means anything to you. There's no big motivation behind that set of technologies, it's just what I'm comfortable with. Both of the tools share the same drop a font on the page to load it mechanic, which is a Vue component. Vue is a JavaScript framework that makes things like dynamically updating text fields much more seamless, and it also enables me to create reusable components like this font upload logic. I say upload, but actually this all happens locally. It's just loading the font into your browser. Let's start with the overview tool because that's the more straightforward of the two. When you drop in a font, the upload script checks a few things and hands a reference to the file to the overview script, which is another Vue component. The overview script then takes that file and uses another tool, opentype.js, to parse it into a format that can be accessed from JavaScript. Once it's done that, it's quite straightforward to go through the tables, find the various bits of info I want to display, and assign them to text fields on the page that the user sees. From there, it's a UI design exercise. The Waterfall tool is more complicated, but it starts the same way. You drop a font, or this time a number of fonts, and the upload script hands a list of them to the Waterfall script, which is again a Vue component. This time, because we're potentially dealing with multiple fonts, each one gets assigned a unique ID, which the tool can reference later. The first step is to load the font into the browser as a web font, so we can use it on the page. If you've used that @fontface rule to load custom web fonts, that's what this is. We assign it a name, which is the ID from earlier, and then tell the browser to load it. In the meantime, the script is also loading the dictionary file, which is that list of 58,000 words from earlier. It loads that from the server, but you can also supply your own dictionary file, in which case it'll do that instead. Both loading the font and loading the dictionary happen asynchronously, and they're usually taking place at the same time. When they're both complete, then the script moves on to the next step, which is calculating the word lengths. For that, the script creates a canvas element, which is a way of drawing graphics using HTML and JavaScript in a browser. It then goes through all those 58,000 words, writes them on the canvas in the specified font, and then uses the measure text method from before to get their length. Because it's not actually physically drawing the canvas or updating any pixels, this is pretty quick, and you don't see it happening. When it measures the length of a word, the script puts the word into a bucket with other words of similar lengths. The size of the buckets is defined by the tolerance setting, so you can change that. And it keeps a list of these buckets in ascending order. So if your desired length is 538, that might be in the 530 to 540 bucket, and it just finds that in the list and shows you everything that's in it. For any other fonts you've added, it just repeats the process to create a list of buckets for each one. As you drag the slider at the top, it's just going through each list and showing you results from the relevant bucket, which it can do really fast. It will of course slow down again if you do something like change the capitalization of the text or the bucket size, because then it needs to rerun the measuring step. That's basically how the tool works. The script is a little more complicated than that, but just so it can handle one or two other features. Things like you can use Shift and the arrow keys to set the target length in 10-unit increments, or you can remove fonts you've uploaded without having to refresh the page. I'm hesitant to add too many features beyond that. Once or twice I've been asked about supporting Monospace fonts with the Waterfall tool. I think the solution there is actually just to use a different tool. I think too many features is absolutely a potential problem with anything like this, and so everything on the workshop is designed to be quite simple and maintainable. As a solo developer with limited time and budget for this project, it's difficult to justify adding features that aren't either pretty easy to develop or generally quite useful to a lot of people. On that subject, let's talk briefly about what's next for the project. Since it probably won't be more features, there's one or two things I'd like to add, but nothing major. The next tool I've been working on, albeit a little slowly, I'm calling Bastard, after the printing term bastard type, which is metal type where the typeface is of a different point size from the body. It's a tool for visualizing vertical metrics. For various reasons, there are at least 3 different sets of ascender, descender, and leading values in a font, and depending on the context, any of them could be used. There's also no clear consensus on what they each should be. Each of them has a slightly different purpose and an ideal value, and they're not usually the same. Different software will use different ones in different contexts. The goal of the Bastard tool is just to visualize these values in a straightforward way. to provide a simple UI for seeing how other existing fonts are set up. When I started the design for my Monospace typeface MD.io, I actually used the overview tool quite a bit, dropping in other monos I thought were successful and making notes about what kind of proportions and metrics they had. I've recently completed a new typeface, and in the final production stages, I used a prototype of the Bastard tool to compare its vertical metrics with some similar fonts. When it's just a case of dropping a file into a browser, it's really easy to get a range of examples from other designs. I'm still working out exactly how I want this tool to work, figuring out the UI and things, and as I just mentioned, I've recently completed a new typeface, so Bastard won't be published until after that's released. But I wanted to give you a preview now and to say that yes, I am still working on these tools. So that's the Massdriver Workshop, how it works and what's coming next for the project. If you're interested in contributing, suggestions for new tools are always welcome. I'm also working on making the scripts fully open source. Right now they're not hidden, but the code is messy and not very well documented. When I have more time, I think it would be great to document everything properly and open up the GitHub repository for other contributors. In the meantime, I'll gladly hear suggestions for new tools or feedback on the current ones. Before I finish, I'd just like to say thank you to ATypI for inviting me and having me here, and thank you for listening. If you have any questions, I'll hand you over to the not pre-recorded version of myself in just a moment. Thank you so much.